Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Tracy Glenn, and I'm one of the organizers of the Tertulias Fredericton series, along with Christy Elaine and Matthew Hayes from St. Thomas University and Daniel Tubb from the University of New Brunswick. So I want to begin by first acknowledging that we're on the stolen territory of the Wolastoqey, and that these lands are subject to the peace and friendship treaties signed between the British Crown and the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanagi region. So for tonight, so Tertulias, I think most of you here tonight have been to a Tertulia before, but if you haven't, it's a kind of philosophy cafe where we usually talk about big thinkers or artists, people who have shaped our lives. Over the last little while, we've been doing talks and panels on timely issues. So tonight we're fortunate to have Anthony Fenton with us, so he's going to be talking about Canada's role in the war in Yemen. So Anthony Fenton is a PhD candidate at York University in the Department of Political Science, and he's looking at the political economy of Canada and Saudi relations. He's also you may have read his works in Canadian Dimension. He also is the co-author of a book on Haiti with Eve Engler, Canada and Haiti, Waging War on the Poor Majority. Tonight's talk is also being recorded and will be made available on the MB Media Co-op website later in a few days, so you can tell your friends about that. So Anthony's going to speak. If you have questions or comments, you can post them in the chat room. We have a small crowd here tonight, so hopefully we can have a good discussion. And I think that's all. So I'll hand that over to Anthony.
Great, thanks, Tracy, and thanks everyone for tuning in or logging in. Much appreciated. As Tracy mentioned, for many years now, I've been working on my PhD dissertation. I actually began writing this particular project in 2013, so we're coming up on year 9, or in year 9. It's been quite a process. I'm trying to cover the period in my research from basically the earliest point of contact between Canada and the states of the Arabian Peninsula, primarily Saudi Arabia, but also the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Sultanate of Oman. And over the last 7 years, specifically been focusing as almost a side project, you could say, on Canada's role in and around the war in Yemen. Since March 2015, when what you could call the latest phase of the war began, with the sort of the foreign intervention aspect entering into the civil war. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But basically, I'm just going to maybe start by giving a quick update on where things are at right now, because it's actually quite a unique situation Yemen is in, with about 5 weeks of a truce or ceasefire that's been underway, the longest holding ceasefire in those 7 years. There's still been violations of it here and there, but most notably, probably, there haven't been any Saudi-led airstrikes. So for the first time in 7 years, the Yemenis haven't had to worry about bombs being dropped from the sky on them by the Saudi-led coalition. I always say Saudi-led, of course. It's also been a U.S.-backed, primarily militarily. When you read about the conflict in the newspaper, typically you'll see the Houthis, the rebels, proceeded with the prefix Iran-backed Houthis all the time. You will seldom see the U.S. or U.K. or Canada-backed coalition, and of course there are serious questions of proportionality in such framing, because to whatever extent Iranians are in fact arming the Houthis, the scale of that is tiny in comparison to the amount that the West in particular is arming and has armed for decades the Saudi coalition, or the Saudi states that comprise the coalition. And of course, that also includes Egypt. Their air force has been involved in the conflict. Countries like Pakistan, actually, who've long been militarily allied with with Saudi Arabia. In fact, for years they've kept thousands of Pakistani troops in Saudi Arabia as part of some sort of arrangement, but they refused to take part in the war. Qatar was initially involved from 2015, but that ended in 2017 with the blockade led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt against Qatar, where they called for the closure of Al Jazeera, among other things, and failed. They kind of had the tacit support of Trump at the time, but the blockade failed, and Al Jazeera lives on. And now that they've restored relations with Qatar, but I don't think they've re-entered the conflict, as far as I know. And that's interesting or notable, I guess, because Qatar for years played a role moderating the aspects of the civil war that had taken place, say, from 2004 to 2011. May as well back up a little bit there in order to kind of frame where the conflict came from. We saw the Houthi, which is the name of a family in Yemen. It's either indigenous Yemeni movement out of northern Yemen. First appeared in what they call the first Houthi war, took place in 2004. And at the time, you'll recall that Yemen had a long time authoritarian strongman leader, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ultimately, 6 wars were waged between 2004 and 2010. As I said, oftentimes they would go from war to ceasefire, oftentimes brokered by Qatar and others, up to 2011, when the Arab Spring kind of swept through the region, buoyed by the protests in Tunisia and in Egypt in particular, where Mubarak was forced to resign ultimately. The protests in Yemen grew in size and intensity, and eventually forced Saleh out of power. Now, he had been sort of on his last legs for a number of years, especially during those wars that were fought. And of course, Saudi Arabia always has loomed large in these kind of conflicts for decades, but of course, in recent years, even more so. Oftentimes playing role behind the scenes, money, influence, patronage, and so on and so forth. Of course, in 2011, when Saleh was forced out, there was all sorts of attempts by the so-called international community and the Saudis to have a transition. So they had appointed basically who was Saleh's vice president, interim president. He was supposed to serve, Hadi was his name, supposed to serve for a couple of years while they got everything together and got proper elections, and inclusivity was one of the buzzwords, I'm sure, restoring democracy, etc. But ultimately, in 2014, with Hadi still holding on to power, backed by Saudis and others, he had the match that seemed to ignite the ultimate Houthi takeover of the capital, Sana'a, in late 2014, was taking away some fuel subsidies that had been in place. So there are a lot of legitimate grievances bound up with these movements, whether it's be the Houthi movement or more popular movements from the south, also grievances against the Saleh regime. And then Hadi kind of was a continuation of that, attempted a kind of a continuation of that status quo. And it eventuated in the Houthis taking over the north by February of 2015. Hadi had initially resigned under popular pressure and pressure from the Houthis in 2014, but then he went down the south and to Aden and reneged, and then shortly thereafter he fled to Saudi Arabia and asked them to invade on his behalf, and that sort of was what became this coalition. So Saudis obviously agreed, and at the time, also important to remember. All those years of the six wars between the Houthis and the Saleh regime, that was under the previous Saudi king, Abdullah, and it was when the bin Salmans took over after Abdullah's death in 2015. There's a sense you see in a lot of the commentary that the MBS, who at that point wasn't even the crown prince, but had his designs not only on being crown prince but ultimately the next king, when his father passed away, decided this was going to be his war to wage, and sort of did so with popular support initially, with big grand statements and designs. They even had their own George Bush Jr. style mission accomplished statement, which was as farcical shortly thereafter as was Bush's. And it's continued to be basically a stalemate type conflict ever since, with many twists and turns along the way, many complexities that I can't possibly get into here today. But some of the, in broad strokes, some of the things to know are, so the United Arab Emirates, we mentioned they were part of the coalition. They remain a part of the coalition, even though they initially had soldiers in occupying the country up until 2019, when they did this very public pullout. But at the same time, ever since then, they've created they bases they've been building on island off the coast of Yemen. I don't want to mispronounce the strait, but between Africa and Yemen. Like a landing strip there. They have, I believe they either have troops or proxy troops in Socotra, which is another island off the southeast coast of Yemen, strategically situated. And then there's a separatists in the south also who control the south that are also UAE backed. And so you have a sort of a carving up. You know, the Saudis, of course, historically have played a huge role in the north, and there have been border disputes, and a lot of the legitimate grievances that the Houthis have are with the Saudis. But of course, their official slogan is, the Houthis' official slogan has been, you know, death to USA, death to Saudis, death to Israel, death to all Jews, sort of statement. But they've had legitimate grievances against the outsized U.S. influence. The U.S. has obviously been fighting also alongside this whole situation, the so-called war against Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Drone strikes, taking out so-called terrorists in the area for years and years now. And so there of course has also been a blockade. And I should also, of course, mention leading up to the truce. I mean, it was getting, according to the World Food Program and NGOs like the Norwegian Refugee Council, you know, high numbers of internally displaced people. Up to 400,000 people have died, either directly or indirectly, as a result of the conflict in those 7 years. It seems like since 2017, they've perpetually in Yemen been on the verge of famine or near famine conditions. And so it's really, it's pretty bleak in many ways. And yet, you know, you mentioned Haiti at the onset. It's like, much like the Haitian people, you know, they keep seeming to find reservoirs of resolve and resistance, and continuing to fight for self-determination. And then, so that's, I'm sure I've left a lot out, and feel free to chat about whatever aspects I've glossed over or left out later on. But I wanted to turn a little bit to Canada. You know, like what is Canada's position on this war been? What kind of stake or interests has Canada had in Yemen, going back a number of decades, and yeah, what impact has that had, if any, on the conflict? So, you know, I should say, like, as soon as this particular phase of the war launched in March 2015, it was the sort of lame duck Canadian Foreign Minister Rob Nicholson. He'd taken over for John Baird, who ironically his very last foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia to pay fealty to the new king after Abdullah died. But Rob Nicholson unequivocally said, you know, Canada supports the Saudis and the UAE coalition against the Houthis, and that's basically been the policy ever since. Even though they've tried to, you could say, disguise that with, you know, proclamations of support for the humanitarian situation, and sending, you know, the last year I think it was $70 million that Canada pledged to this humanitarian situation in Yemen. I should note that I think it was they were calling for something like $4 billion and only got $1 billion, so like a quarter of what was asked for and what was needed. But you know, going back to, this isn't the first civil war that Canada's had sort of a peripheral role at all. There, you can go back to the 60s. Canada played a role as a peacekeeper in monitoring the border when sort of the Egyptian-led proxy war against the Saudi-backed imamate. Ironically enough, the imamate, which had been overthrown by the Yemeni Republicans, that was the side that was supported by Saudi Arabia, and technically you could trace the Houthis back to the Yemenite. There's some aspects of the Houthi movement who want to restore the Yemenite. Things get flipped around, and of course Egypt, who was once on the side of the Republicans, is on the side of the Saudis now. So Canada played that role, and so familiarized itself with the region. That was in an era before Canada had any formal relations with any of the countries in the region. And it would only be with the oil crisis in 1973. It's kind of like an explosion in Canadian interest, in sudden Canadian interest in Saudi Arabia in particular, and the petrodollars that needed to be recycled as a result of the sudden and massive increase in the price of oil and the balance of payments issues that created for the West in particular. And at that point, Canada had a vested interest in what they call the stability of the Saudi royal family and all the royal families of the region. And Canadian policies were pursued and predicated on that from that day forward, arguably to this day. Now, in the 1990s, it was in the early 1990s that Yemen was unified. There was a civil war that led to that unification, and that led to Saleh's taking over as the strongman for the next couple of decades. Just to give you an indication of like the Canadian strategic calculus. Now, in the 1980s, there was a large Canadian oil company that got a major concession in South Yemen called Canadian Occidental, which short term was called Canoxy. And so in 1994, a Canadian Minister of Defense, I think it was Barney Danson, I think it was at the time, he said basically of the situation, of the Civil War and of the outcome of the Civil War, he said Canada had a direct interest in the outcome of this conflict emanating from our desire to protect the substantial interests in Yemen of Canadian Occidental Petroleum. Our overriding concern was, however, not to jeopardize Canoxy's position, whatever the outcome of the Civil War. And so you can similarly look at the Civil War of today in a similar vein. There's no oil company, Canadian oil company. They sold those interests not until 2012. There are smaller Canadian oil companies that actually have, one of them has recently restarted operations inside Yemen, called Cal Valley. But basically, you know, Canada is very much sort of follows capital. It follows and tries to fall under the wing of the U.S. strategy in the region. And so I will have to mention or frame the Canadian sort of posture, military strategic posture in the region. So Canada has one military base in the region in Kuwait. They had gotten into a dispute with the United Arab Emirates back in when the war in Afghanistan was still on, and Canada had a staging base in the UAE. There was a landing rights dispute in Canada, and the UAE shut down that base, and Canada had to seek another one. But of course, it's really the U.S. that has a massive military footprint, from Djibouti to the large base at Al Udeid in Qatar, to a number of bases inside the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. And most recently, they've reestablished the base in Saudi Arabia, one of the reasons for which was Houthi attacks from Yemen inside of Saudi Arabia against oil installations. Earlier this year, I should also mention that they actually reached for the first time with their missiles and drones Emirati oil institutions in Abu Dhabi. And that caused a lot of alarm. In fact, I would be shocked if that didn't factor into their subsequent attempt to try and ultimately resolve the situation. A first step being this truce that they've agreed to in April. But as far as Canadian interests go, so you've got, but within those military bases that the U.S. has, so Canada since 2001 or thereabouts has been committed to the U.S. sort of constabulary naval operations. And in fact, the U.S. has just recently added a new addition to this, where they basically promised Saudi Arabia that they'll patrol the waters around Yemen more closely to try and seize weapons that may head in that conflict. And Canada will inevitably likely be a part of that naval mission. Canadian soldiers serve in the base in Qatar. They serve in the base, obviously they have their base in Kuwait. They serve in the United Arab Emirates at Al Dhafra. And there's a so-called Canadian contingent that occasionally does also go inside of Saudi Arabia. Over the past few years in particular, Canada has signed a number of what they call memorandums of understanding or defense cooperation agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Kuwait. There's one underway. I'm not sure if it's been completed with Bahrain. Of course, they've had one for a number of years with Saudi Arabia. And in recent years, Canadians, outside of COVID when things shut down for a couple of years, but Canadian defense industry has been increasingly present at the numerous arms bazaars that take place inside the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia had the World Defense Show Bazaar in February, and the Canadians had a contingent there as well. But you see, there's a lot of examples of Canadian companies outside of the big one, the elephant in the room that I haven't mentioned yet, General Dynamics Land System, that's producing the 742 light armored vehicles for the Saudi Royal, not the Royal Guard, the special unit, the presidential unit that is tasked with protection of the Saudi royal family. There's companies like CAE out of Montreal who train UAE drone pilots on their non-armed Predator drones. Obviously, there's companies like Westcam who've been in the news recently and lauded for the role that they're playing, providing high-tech cameras and targeting pods to the drones that are being used to fight Russia in Ukraine, bought via Turkey. But this Canadian company has facilities in Saudi Arabia where they're servicing these pods, and they play a critical role, be it drones, be it attack helicopters. You've got companies like PAL Aerospace out in Newfoundland who've got a major contract, thanks in part to the former Chief of Defense Staff Rick Hillier, providing surveillance planes to the Emirates. And there's quite a long list of these smaller, either Canadian kind of service companies or surveillance type companies, or just Canadian companies that make key components for key larger systems that are deployed in the war in Yemen in particular, that we've seen examples of over the years. And a lot of this has come from footage taken by the Houthis themselves. Although it's tapered off in recent year or two, they did a really good job for a number of years. Just they'd have a skirmish with Saudi Arabia, and they'd seize vehicles or weapons, and they would proudly display them in these videos, and enables researchers to point out, oh wow, that's how we learned that certain weapons are in the conflict, is because they've been seized by the Yemenis. There's companies like the Street Group, which is owned by a Russian Canadian, German Gutrov. His assets, has a home in Toronto, but he's built the world's largest private manufacturing facility for armored vehicles, and he's been a key supplier to the Saudi and Emirati coalition since the war in Yemen began, providing hundreds of vehicles, and upwards of 100 of them have been destroyed or seized by the Houthis, which would suggest that they probably send, upwards of 1,000 or more of these vehicles into the conflict. And so I think it's important to mention all these things to understand why Canada has such a hard time, living up to its professed feminist foreign policy or respect for human rights, or even respect for or application of things like the Arms Trade Treaty, which it acceded to in 2019, if memory serves. So the relationships regarding weapon sales doesn't go back all that far. For years, it was a case that Canada refused to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia in particular, because they had a policy against providing arms to or selling arms to anyone who was either a party to directly or potentially could be a party to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But this changed. It started to change toward the late 1970s, again after the oil crisis really started to deepen Canada's relationships with the Arab governments in the Arabian Peninsula. and of course, Canada's participation in the Gulf War. But I should mention that it was Pierre Trudeau, his historic visit. He was the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit Saudi Arabia in 1980. And it was after that visit, which was used to justify basically the signing off of the green light to allow Canadian companies like General Dynamics at the time, General Motors, to negotiate the sale of these large armored vehicle contracts. And by the end of the Gulf War, Canadian officials could say the trade relationship between Saudi Arabia and Canada is no longer just an oil for food swap. Now it was an oil for food and weapons swap, and that's pretty much continued to this day. And so in 2014, it's interesting because this deal coincidentally was closed just about a year before the war in Yemen really heated up there in 2015, and the production started, I think, 2015, 2016, but by 2017, they started to ship these light armored vehicles under this massive $14 billion or so contract involving over 500 Canadian companies in the supply chain from coast to coast, emanating mostly from or around London, Ontario. But I'm sure there are even companies in New Brunswick, smaller component making companies that feed into the lab. But what was most important where New Brunswick was concerned was in 2017 when DP World, so here we bring in the United Arab Emirates again, the Dubai Ports World, took over a 30-year operating lease, I believe, of Port St. John. That had been announced in 2016. And almost immediately thereafter, we began to see that the Saudi ships were showing up to pick up the labs. And how they did that, it was quite interesting because for years and years, Halifax had been the port of entry for the Saudi ships. And what the Canadian trucking company would literally drive two or three at a time, the labs to the Halifax port. They would pick them up. But one of the problems there was a pesky worker there who would take photos of the labs on the docks. And the Saudis are notoriously desirous of secrecy, as much as secrecy as possible when it comes to arms deals in particular. They don't want prying eyes. And so we figure when the Emiratis took over the Port St. John, the GDLS and the Bahri, the Saudi states of the shipping company, had to have decided, okay, let's engage with the rails. So they started shipping them out via railway to New Brunswick. And although it was harder to track initially, the reporter in particular, Joseph Tunney, started showing up there with his camera and was able to get some photos of this big warehouse that they had on the site there, where they would just basically deliver the labs and then they would just stockpile them until the ships came. They load them on the ships, and but that didn't last as long as they probably had initially planned, because at the end of 2018. You guys organized the protest at the dock, and the longshoremen respected it and refused on that one day to load. And this scared the DP World, and it angered them. And obviously it found its way back very quickly to General Dynamics themselves, because as a result of that, they totally diverted and reorganized their logistics schedule in order to then ship the labs out of Baltimore. And they've been doing that ever since then, as far as we know. They've gone back to the truck company that they originally had driving them to Halifax. And so since then have tried mostly in vain to get evidence of the labs either at the port in Baltimore or on the trucks being delivered from Paddock Trucking Company. And of course, I should also mention there was a quite well-covered protest at Paddock, the trucking company that delivers them, that 2020 now. And but since then, we haven't seen too much activity. But I think one thing that comes to mind when I was thinking about this was that there's a project there in New Brunswick for anyone who wants to undertake it, in terms of following up that period with some intensive Freedom of Information Act requests, just to see what what is the relationship, try to understand better the relationship between DP World and the Saudi shipping company at the time. I believe that I understand that there was the longshoremen were sanctioned for not crossing the line that day, and that there was the Canadian Labor Relations Board heard a case about that. And I still never heard what the outcome was that, and I would love to learn more about that. But it was a successful action, and the only problem is the follow up since then. They've continued to ship the labs. They're probably about 2/3 of the way through the entire shipment protocol, and the Canadian government just continues to obfuscate and just go business as usual, with little opposition, of course, from any of the Canadian political parties. And the media as well. It's been all COVID all the time. Of course, the last few months, it's been all Ukraine and Russia. And the situation between Canada and Saudi Arabia, just to close, in 2018, you recall, there was a diplomatic spat. Before Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in October 2018, Canada and Saudi Arabia had experienced their most fractious rift in the history of their almost 50-year relationship. So you may recall, I'm sure, that the Canadian embassy in Riyadh tweeted something about Saudi Arabia should release human rights activists. One of them was Badawi's, Raif Badawi's sister. And this resulted in a clapback from Saudi Arabia. They immediately cut off relationships. The king issued a decree about getting out of contracts and not signing any new contracts with Canada, and obviously recalled their ambassador. Canada's ambassador was declared persona non grata. And you don't hear, at the time, I have in my files, it was a record-setting amount of media coverage. Every aspect of the Canadian-Saudi relationship, which of course I was already at the time 5 years into examining, happened all at once, and then it went away. And yet the diplomatic spat didn't go away. Just recently, last October, is just quite interesting, because I follow it as close as I can. I try to follow the Arabic, any developments in the Arabic press as much as I can. But what I noticed was that a Canadian diplomat by the name of Perry Calderwood all of a sudden appeared in Saudi Arabia last October. I was like, Perry Calderwood, that name rings a bell. He's a former Canadian ambassador to Venezuela, former Canadian ambassador to Pakistan. But at the time, up until the moment he was parachuted into Riyadh, he was the Canadian ambassador to Cuba. There was no press release announcing the end of his tenure in Cuba, and no release announcing his arrival in Saudi Arabia. And yet here he was appearing in selfies with other ambassadors, clearly doing the rounds, which is quite fascinating. So that is to say that it appears clear to me that efforts are afoot to what they call normalize the relationship, but they're doing it very slowly and very systematically. I think that Canada almost appreciated, especially when Khashoggi was assassinated, they didn't mind having had that spat, because that removed them from any uncomfortable conversation they would have had to have about, well, why are you still friendly with Saudi Arabia when they've just gone and murdered this journalist? It made it easier for them to impose the Magnitsky sanctions on the alleged assassins of Khashoggi. Because then they were like, hey, we're in a diplomatic spat with them. We're hardly even on speaking terms. So what do we, it was easy for them to make statements about the Khashoggi assassination. And yet Canada didn't suspend arms transfers like other countries contemplate. Like Germany still isn't transferring weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example, as a result, in part because of the assassination. What they did was they said, okay, we're gonna review our arms export policy with Saudi Arabia. But after they dragged that out for about a year, they quietly announced, okay, we're going to resume. We're going to lose $2 or more billion worth of possible sales, so we're just going to resume the export permits. And there have even been books written by prominent U.S. Academics recently. Everyone seems to want to write a book about MBS, and they decide they like to mention Canada in passing. David Ottaway wrote a book where he falsely said that Canada suspended the lab deal following the Khashoggi assassination, which obviously did not happen. So there's a lot of confusion about the situation, but the diplomatic spat technically continues to this day. And yet at the same time, last thing I wanted to mention, just to bring us up to speed, that Stephen Harper, former prime minister, just 2 days ago appeared in Saudi Arabia for the third time in 7 months. And in the picture that they showed him with high-level Al-Jubeir, former foreign affairs minister, I think he's a secretary of foreign affairs now, it says they're discussing relations between Canada and Saudi Arabia and ways to move forward. And so you have to wonder if there's in any respect Harper's there at the behest of Justin Trudeau. Of course, you've got major companies like Barrick Gold that have a major copper concession inside Saudi Arabia, and you've seen just a real uptick in the sort of receptiveness of Saudi Arabia to associate themselves with Canada, with all these number of conferences. Cirque du Soleil's got a major performance going on there that just kicked off again. There's a whole long list we could go over, but it appears that they're trying to normalize relationships, and it would appear also to only be a matter of time before Canada's quietly or otherwise fully resumed relationship with Saudi Arabia, basically putting us back to square one where we were before the diplomatic spat. And while I'm sure Canada welcomes a truce or ceasefire in Yemen, because it's just bad PR, basically back to the strategic calculus. Even if it did continue, I don't think that would stop Canada from reinstituting its relationships. And certainly they're not anytime soon going to be canceling arms deals. And to the contrary, they're pursuing new arms deals as we speak. And so we really need to redouble our efforts and understand this as clearly as we can and find new and interesting ways to counter it. And I think I'll wrap it up there and I'll get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Anthony. That was really interesting. Certainly many parts of that many of us will not have been familiar with. It's a relatively small audience here tonight, but you have a very high quality audience of engaged people in the community here. So I know that there will be some questions that will come from this small and engaged audience. I had a couple just while we're waiting for people's questions to appear in the chat. The first one is that Yemen, I think a lot of Canadians think of Yemen as being a very kind of out of the way part of the world, but it is actually a strategic, a site of it has been for a long time, a very important strategic center of trade. I'm wondering if you can just provide a little bit of background on the role of, I guess it's Aden, the port of Aden in the British Empire, and how that maybe links to some of the ongoing problems in the region.
Gotcha. You take it back as far as you want to, right? I mean, it's kind of like a blessing and a curse. Probably more of a curse in some ways, where the Gulf of Aden feeding into the Arabian Sea. And of course, the Red Sea going up the east coast of Yemen. That's why the British were so heavily involved in obviously occupying. It was there basically a protectorate up until the early 1960s. At that point, and of course, it's just like on the way to India as a critical passage. So not only just to have it for themselves as a possession, but to prevent others like the Soviet Union from having it as their own possession at the time, and sort of having hegemony over the region generally, and then of course as the oil industry developed, to make sure that is as a strategic choke point and a strategic point at which or through which oil travels, that it's just it's got to be policed and patrolled at all times. If we can't or can no longer afford to occupy it, we've got to have in place friendly, agreeable rulers who are going to be make sure our interests are protected. And I think I mentioned the one strait, the Bab el Mandab Strait, in between the southeastern tip of Yemen, and right across it is Djibouti, and how they're it's almost unfathomable when you look on a map that, like, oh, you decide that little island there, you've got, it's called Param Island is the one that you've got to occupy that little island, have an airstrip on there. But yeah, as I mentioned, the waterways all around there are heavily controlled by U.S. Navy, Canadian Navy on its periodic 6-month rotations through there. In fact, there was supposed to be another 6-month rotation happening currently, but they diverted that to the European conflict, interestingly enough. But yeah, and so the UK obviously retreated somewhat from the region, but they maintained a presence there, which ultimately got taken over by the US. The role of gendarme in the region by the US, mostly by the US Navy. And of course, their establishment of all those bases that dot the area now, Djibouti in particular is a huge one. It's just amazing, again, when you look on the map and how small, in such a small area, just how many military bases they've got established there. And it's like, what's ultimately going to challenge that? When the Saudis, for example, had the blockade, they attempted the blockade against Qatar. They're like, yeah, we can host the military. Like, they're basically suggesting, oh, you should shut down that huge military base, Al Udeid. But obviously, the more sensible ones in the Pentagon said, okay, Trump was just firing off tweets like as though he was supporting the blockade, supporting the blockade. But clearly, the expansions at that Qatari base would suggest that they don't plan on closing that anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, just in brief there, yeah, it's obviously been a very strategic area, and I don't know if it has the original strategic value it did, obviously, then when they had a possession in India as well, but clearly for reasons owing to the ongoing existence of the oil industry, that it's going to be for the foreseeable future. Thanks.
The other question I think I had, and then we'll see what other questions are out there, is about can you speak any at all about the kind of technology that is being used in this war? Because I haven't followed it very closely, but my sense is that this is not it's not a peripheral war. It's a war of regional powers, and there are developments and new weapons technologies and new tactics being used, and particularly the drone strike on Saudi Arabian oil refineries. I don't know whether this is an area that you're interested in, but I thought I'd ask in any case. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that are going on here that we should be paying attention to, in addition to the labs, which obviously are high-tech Canadian weapons that are contributing to this conflict?
Yeah, and it's funny, I didn't mention it before, but I should have mentioned actually the question of the labs in terms of another area of confusion. Was that because Canada sold labs over the years to the National Guard, to the Army, and now to the Royal Guard, which is, and that's kind of, I think, what made it historic, because the Royal Guard, actually, they're not involved in Yemen at all. And so these new labs that Canada is being producing, none of them have appeared in the conflict, as far as anyone I know has seen. Whereas the older model labs, we've seen lots of them, mostly in the border areas. So the Sada province in the north, which borders Saudi Arabia, in particular Al Jaf, and Haija is another one where you've seen a lot of the videos come out where you see convoys of these Canadian made, but the older model labs. And that brings me to another interesting point, is that documents that I've obtained through access to information requests suggest that Canada's been producing older model labs, possibly to replace some of the battlefield losses of these older model labs in Yemen. But it's never been reported on. And we don't know the actual scale of these other kind of shipments, but it calls into question, like, okay, what labs have they been shipping this whole time? Is it because the new labs are called these Lab 700s, and the previous ones were the Lab the Lab 3 or the Lab 6, and yeah. So I mean, and people have asked, well, why are these new labs so expensive compared to the old ones? Because they've ordered 700-800 labs at a time before, but never with a $15 billion price tag. And so in terms of like them being high tech, like one of the reasons they're way more expensive is they're way more high tech. They have to totally train a new Saudi, regiment, a new Saudi security division on them, the Royal Guard. So they set up a what they call a campus, basically a training facility in France, in order to train them on the Belgian system, the cannons and the turrets, how to operate them. But other than that, I mean, a lot of the conflict, on the one hand, has been kind of low tech. Like you see the videos of the Houthi fighters. These guys are wearing flip flops. They're clearly like villagers. A lot of them are really young. Got pretty basic weaponry, much of which they get from seizing it from Saudis and their proxy forces, or they're getting from Iran, wherever. But yeah, but in terms of the tech, yes, the drones, the surveillance, the Houthis have been pretty consistently taking down Saudi drones, which suggests on the one hand that they're quite common in the conflict. We haven't seen a lot of evidence of armed drones though in the conflict, mostly just surveillance. So you've had like the Arabian Labs, that's a Canadian company, was bought a few years ago. There's so many drones that are produced that either have Canadian-made targeting tech or Canadian-made engines. Be it the Pratt and Whitney engines made in Montreal, or Rotax. Rotax is a company in Austria, but it's owned by the Bombardier family in part. And as I said before, you have these other, night vision goggles to all sorts of little components. These little Canadian companies that go and flog their wares at these arms bazaars. Every aspect of war fighting today, there's a Canadian company with that's either trying to get that next contract in competition with the multitude of their U.S. and other Western companies. But yeah, so it's a combination. It's interesting though. You see like in 2017, the Westcam had to open up a service facility in Riyadh. It's like, to me, it's like, okay, well, clearly, why would you need to open up a service center where you didn't have one previously? Oh yeah, there's been a war, a hot war raging now for 2 years. Clearly, like, they need repairs in a way that you can't just take the time to send it back to Canada or whatever European service center. They need one in Saudi Arabia. It speaks to the intensity of the war and just how hands-on some of these Canadian companies truly are. And we just, because it's not reported on, because it's not disclosed, it's impossible to say. And the other thing I'll mention, since I just thought of it and you mentioned it, like back in 2018, 2019, I was hired by this law firm to be like something of a expert, not an expert witness, but just to provide some research assistance to them. A couple of members of the Canadian Special Operations Forces had been recruited by a Canadian company that was getting a contract with Saudi Arabia to assist them in counter drone capabilities. So like Yemeni, to help counter Yemeni drones. And they boast to selling Saudi some 800 drones, or providing them with that many over the years. And they've been on the ground in Yemen all these years. No one's ever reported on them. But the reason I got involved is because after the spat happened in 2018, the guy who runs the company laid these two Canadian former JTF-2 soldiers off, saying that he had to, because the Saudis told him they're Canadian, so they couldn't work there anymore. But he was BSing, as it turned out, which is funny. And part of what I was able to show is that Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that there's a diplomatic spat, if they want a Canadian to work for them and to fill a slot, whether in the these massive tourist expansions that they're undertaking along the Red Sea, there's a Canadian they hired to head up that project. There's Canadians working as economists for the state oil company. There's a Canadian who's running who's planning the Saudi, I think it's the subway system or something like that. But they're going to fire these two Canadians because they're, in fact, if there's one sector that was unscathed by the diplomatic spat, it was the defense sector, because they're in the middle of a war. They're not going to say, oh, we're not going to buy from Canadian companies because of this diplomatic spat, and thereby shoot themselves in the foot, so to speak, with respect to trying to oust the Houthis from their control over the capital. So yeah, there's a lot of Canadian tech, a lot of stuff that's never even been discussed publicly, and a lot to come out. And that's why I encourage anybody to dig stuff up as much as they can, because it's there's scandals waiting to be happening when these types of things are exposed. It opens up possibilities for agitation and change that otherwise wouldn't.
Anybody else with questions?
I can ask a question, maybe. Anthony, you did talk about like the misinformation by that author, but I was wondering if you could comment more on the media in Canada. So Post Media recently bought the Irving newspapers too. So I was wondering, like what we can expect to see as well.
It's been frustrating over the years. For a while I was cultivating, like decent dialogue or relations with various Canadian journalists. Like over the years I've done, you could say pre-interviews with like CBC, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, and then they never follow up. They decide, oh, that's too complex or too controversial, or they never tell you. Like I remember the CBC As It Happens, for example. They're like, oh, we're doing a special on Yemen. I spoke to a producer who was very interested. I think I started talking about the street group, the Armored Vehicle Company, because that in particular has fascinated me on its own. Like the fact that there's this like more or less Canadian company providing hundreds and hundreds of vehicles that are having a material impact on this war, and that no Canadian media has ever written about them. And not only is not written about them, has gotten a full debriefing about them and then still decided not to write about them. It boggles the mind, and it's been really really frustrating. So it's very piecemeal. It's very driven by, if as usual, if there's to a certain extent an element of stenography, right? Also, the Canadian government issues a press release or when they release the document that shows that they decided to resume arms export permits. The media will report on it. But if nobody does any of their own research, like organically, whether it's Steve Chase, who's probably written over 150 articles about the situation since 2014, or others, but I mean, there's diamonds in the rough, and there've been some exceptions. Kamal Soleil is a Yemeni Canadian writer who's written some very important stuff. He got a piece in the Globe and Mail only about a month and a half or so ago, written extensive pieces in the Walrus and elsewhere, with a good analysis of the situation in Yemen and Canada's role in it. Of course, one other thing I mentioned that I didn't was, in fact, this wasn't reported on as such, but for years they had a UN expert panel, which included, for the last couple of years, Canadian Queen's University prof, whose name is escaping me at the moment for some reason. But they censured Canada for the first time in two reports, where they said, countries like Canada who are continuing to export weapons to the belligerent countries should stop. They're not helping the situation. Canada, the Canadian government ignored it. Part of the reason they're able to ignore it is because the Canadian media didn't even report on it. And then they shut down. The Saudis engineered the shutdown of that expert panel altogether, so it no longer exists. It was like a fig leaf of investigative power into what human rights violations are taking place, and the Saudis took it away. And guess what? The Yemeni watchdog group said that airstrikes ramped up like they never had before, and this is all in the last 6 months that this happened. And then up to the more recent events, which have seen the Houthi, as Matthew mentioned there, the drone strikes inside Saudi Arabia, inside the UAE. And then ultimately, we're seeing this ceasefire now. But not in any part thanks to the Canadian media's ongoing engagement with the issue. That's it. Nothing else.